going to go ahead and click Next. I'm going to go ahead and save this on my desktop. And now I have the simplest of applications, which, recall, if I run it, just gives me a big white box in the form of an application that looks like this. So very underwhelming, but let's make it a little sexier by going into the nib file. Let me go ahead and drag a label into the middle. Just so I can support iPhone 4 and iPhone 5s. Let me go ahead and click down here, if you haven't noticed this little control bar, and turn on a constraint called vertical center. This will ensure that whatever simulator you're using or whatever device you're using, at least this text will be vertically centered. And by default, let me go ahead and just make the American centric version, Hello World. All right, so now notice what I have in the left-hand side of my screen. All of the familiar files. The program happens to be called Ola, but that's just because I wrote that. Nothing has been actually internationalized yet. But those are all pretty much familiar files. In particular, notice that there's just a single nib file. But if I now want to localize this application, we can do the following. And unfortunately, this feature changes location with every version of Xcode, it seems. But if I go ahead and click on the project at top left, then click on the project to the right of that, you'll notice down here that there's a screen related to localizations, aka internationalization. And if I go ahead and click the plus here, I have a whole bunch of languages that Xcode supports nicely right out of the box. I'm going to go ahead and choose Spanish. And if I zoom out, I'm now being prompted to do a couple of things. Choose files and reference language to create Spanish localization. So it turns out that by default, there's two different files that can take on some other language. One is the nib file, apparently, and one is a file called info.plist.strings. So I'm not going to touch the latter just yet. I'm going to uncheck it and come back to that. But I am going to tell Xcode to localize my nib file. So if I go down here to finish, what I now get is both English and Spanish. And if I go back to my nib, notice that by default, I still see Hello World. But notice what's different about the nib at top left. Yeah, it looks like it's become a hierarchy of sorts. If I expand this triangle, I seem to have English, which is what I had a moment ago, and then I have Spanish, which is apparently the same. OK, so it actually hasn't done any translation for me. That's for a human to actually do. But I can go into this nib now, and I can say something like, Hola, mundo. Change it there, save it, and now I have my English version and my Spanish version. So let's see what now happens. I'm going to go back to the simulator. Or rather, let me go ahead and spawn the simulator by running the code. It's been built. It's being installed into the simulator. And when it comes to the foreground, we should see Hello World. Now let me disclaim, about every 5th time I try this on different computers, it doesn't work. So if it blows up, realize I've issued a disclaimer, which means it's OK. But if I now go here, these are just all the applications we've been installing in recent weeks. I'm going to right-click over to the settings. And if you've never done this on your own phone or iPad, you can go to General, International, Language. And I'm going to choose Espanol for Spanish. Done. It's going to change language, ... Xcode's going to crash because it doesn't like it when you do that with it still running. But I'm going to go ahead now and rerun the simulator. And now we have a Spanish version of the application. So the only thing that's changed, crash aside, is that I changed the settings in my application to actually be Spanish instead of English. And if I went back to English, I should hopefully see Hello World instead. But a couple of things haven't changed. In particular, what's the name of this application, apparently? So it's still Hola 1. So irrespective of the language my phone is configured with, the application is still the same. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe you want the game to be called Angry Birds, no matter what the language actually is. Or maybe you want to localize that too. So you can do that in different places. So let me actually go ahead and open up a second example here, whereby we start fresh. Single view application. Hola 2 will be this application. Whoops. And save it on the desktop. And let's do something that's almost the same, but this time I want to do a little bit more in code. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my nib file. This time I'm going to drag my label, and I'm not going to hard code it into the nib, because recall that if we do a little bit more programming, we can actually control that label programmatically from code. So if I want to do this, let me make sure things line up with the online code so that you can play along at home after. if I want to actually do this, what's the first thing I need to do to wire my code up to my nib file? Because recall, all I have is the empty boilerplate code thus far. Yeah?
You need to create an IB outlet.
OK, so I need to create an IB outlet. It likely belongs in what file? OK, so somewhere in the view controller. And early on, recall that we put almost all of our properties just by convention into the .h file. But then gradually last week, we started moving more and more of our properties and method declarations into the .m file, the implementation file, just because there's really no reason to inform the whole world what our private implementation details are. So I'll go ahead and open up viewcontroller.m, and I can implement this inside of my nameless category. So I'm going to declare a property with a few attributes, but we'll come back to that. It's going to be a UI label, and I'll just call this label. Now I need a couple of more things. If this is going to be an IB outlet, I need to say IB outlet. And what attributes would be appropriate for this outlet, for this IB outlet? Well, one is always easy. We haven't seen atomic, so non-atomic is fine. We're not writing multi-threaded code here within this application. Read only or read write? The goal is to recreate the Hello World application, by this time in code, telling it what to say, either Hello World or Hola Mundo. OK, so read write, since I want to be able to change what it's pointing at. And then lastly, I can actually go with weak. So we haven't spent too much time on this, but recall that strong versus weak somehow relates to how the pointers are going to be dealt with. And in this case, weak suffices, because all I need is a pointer to a UI label. But I'm not the owner of that UI label per se. The owner is really the nib file. And when the nib is loaded, it will take care of ensuring that the RAM that's necessary to store that label on the screen will be allocated by it. I am just some other guy, viewcontroller.m, that similarly wants to talk to that pointer, but it's not really mine per se, so weak suffices. Someone else owns it. I did not instantiate it myself. It came from the nib. So after this, I now have programmatic access to the label. So what do I want to do? Well, I'm going to get rid of the did receive memory warning. There's not much we can do if this application runs out of memory, because there's terribly little going on, just that UI label. And I am going to put some additional code into viewDidLoad. First, again, by convention, I'm going to call the parent class's viewDidLoad method, whatever that happens to do. And when this view loads, so when the nib is loaded from disk, and the rectangle is constructed, and that UI label is placed in the middle of the screen, I want to do one last configuration detail, namely self.label.text. .text is what's actually inside of that label, is going to get, and this is the new part, NS localized string. And now, according to Xcode's prompts here, it wants a key and or a comment. So I somehow need to provide it with an identifier for that string. It doesn't want me to put, for instance, hello world per se, but rather a generic key that's going to be defined in two different places, two separate files, so that I can look up that value dynamically. So comment, I'm going to actually leave nil. Comment is just for really the humans doing the translations. If you can use tools to automatically generate a file we're about to generate manually, so that if you are the programmer who maybe only speaks English, but you want to tell other developers who actually speak multiple languages what this string represents, you can do it in the form of a comment there, so that when they automatically generate the file we're about to generate manually, they know what you mean by that key. So I'm going to choose something arbitrary but sensible, like greeting. So quote unquote greeting is not what I want the user to see. It's just going to be a key into a table of strings. So to create this, I'm going to go up to File, New, File. And we haven't seen this one before, but if you poke around, you'll start seeing some other useful things. If I go to Resource, notice there's a few resources here. Property list we've seen before. Strings file is another. And according to the description, it is an empty strings file. It's just a text file. So let's go ahead and click Next. By default, I'm going to call this localizable.strings. And Xcode knows by default to look for a file by that name. And if it's present, go ahead and allow the user to define multiple languages, strings in there. So I click Create. And now I have this text file over on the left-hand side. Notice that there's just some generic comments at the top. And it's in here where I can now define some key value pairs. All right, so now if I want to go ahead and define a key value pair, let's go ahead and define what? Greeting has to map to what? Hello world or Hola Mundo. And then we're going to need to do that not in the same file, but in two different places. So before we do that, let me go up to my project settings as before. Hola2 is the project. And let me go ahead and add proactively Spanish. Unfortunately, by default, Xcode only seems to know about these two default files, viewcontroller.nib and infoplist.strings. We're not doing anything with the nib this time, so just to keep things clean, I'm going to uncheck that. Infoplist.strings will come back to, and now I have a Spanish language, but unfortunately I haven't solved the